So excited to welcome all of these viewers tuning in here in Los Angeles, across the US and in the United Kingdom, including our guest Noreena Hertz, who is Zooming with us from England, and her father from London, who also gets to join us. So thank you for tuning in today. I'm Nadine Watt. I am a member of Visionary Women since its inception, and I am currently the governance chair and on the board since 2017. I'm a real estate developer living in Southern California with 2 children, and I'm very excited to be a part of Visionary Women. It's become part of my life and my daily routine. As you know, Visionary Women is a unique nonprofit, a women's giving circle and learning circle with a mission to help women and girls everywhere. We started in Los Angeles as a community of like-minded women supporting other women. But during the pandemic, as we pivoted to online programming, we have greatly expanded our reach. We continue to offer world-class speakers and look forward to gathering again in person this fall. Although we hope to continue also with online programming with speakers who aren't in LA, like today's speaker joins us from abroad. We have a wonderful program today called The Lonely Century: How to Restore Connection in a World That's Pulling Apart, based on the best-selling book by Noreena Hertz and moderated by Professor Ted Robles. Ted is a professor in the Department of Psychology at the University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA to us. He studies the biological mechanisms that explain how social relationships influence health. He also co-leads the Engage Well Pod of the Semel Healthy Campus Initiative Center at UCLA, which focuses on fostering new connections, improving the quality of existing social connections, and promoting positive and inclusive social interactions on the UCLA campus. Ted, I hand it over to you to start with Noreena.
Okay, thank you. And wonderful to see everyone today. And Noreena, it's wonderful to have this opportunity to talk with you about your book. I want to make sure we spend a lot of our time discussing the book, but maybe give you a chance to just sort of introduce yourself and where you're at, and then we can go from there.
Sure. So I'm a professor as well. I'm based at UCL, University College London, in London. I'm an economist, and but my interest in economics has throughout my career spanned where economics really rubs up against psychology, against politics, against sociology, and this is my latest book, and I'm really delighted that it's being so well received across the world. It's coming out in 22 languages, which is very exciting for an author. Every time you get your foreign edition, it's the most exciting thing. And it's great to see it really gaining traction across the globe, and fabulous to be with you all. I, of course, wish I was in person in California right now, but us Brits are not yet allowed on your shores, hopefully soon.
And I want to just put in a plug for this book. I was showing Noreena earlier that this is my copy. I have this many Post-its in it because you're just the perspective that you take covers it's so broad, and that's what I really appreciate about your work and how you've thought about loneliness. And I'm hoping we'll be able to share that with the audience today. We're going to be talking about loneliness a lot, and so maybe a good place to start would be defining loneliness. In my field, in psychology, we define it as this subjective internal distress that you experience when you notice your social needs aren't being met by your immediate social network, like your friends and family. But you ask your readers to take a broader perspective on things like feeling left out. And in addition to loneliness as this internal state, feeling bereft of love and closeness, how do you, from your perspective, how should we be defining loneliness in addition to that?
So for me, loneliness, of course, is that feeling of feeling disconnected from your friends and family and craving intimacy and connection with them and not feeling that met. And it's a very, very profound feeling for anyone who has experienced loneliness, as I'm sure each of us on this call have at some point in our lives. It's a very, very, very profound feeling of lacking. But loneliness also can be a feeling of feeling invisible. of feeling unseen, of feeling unheard. So for me, loneliness is a sense of feeling disconnected from your friends and family and those closest to you, but it's also a feeling of being disconnected from your fellow citizens, from your politicians, from your co-workers, from your employers. So for me, loneliness is personal, but it's also political, and its drivers are economic, technological, I'm sure we'll come back to these, and also, of course, to do with the choices we make about how it is we lead our lives.
And one of the things, and we're going to touch on a lot of those topics, because I think, again, your perspective on the broad sets of influences, but also the responsibilities that we have as individuals, is what I think what truly makes your take on loneliness really unique. And I know for many of us, including the folks who invited you here and myself, we're very interested in the health impacts of loneliness, both on physical and mental health. 4 years ago, I co-wrote a paper with Julianne Holt-Lundstad and at BYU and my colleague David Sabar at University of Arizona. And we argued that improving social connections and reducing social isolation should be a public health priority, much in the same way there's a Minister of Loneliness in the UK now. And a public health priority like, improving healthy eating or increasing physical activity. And I'm wondering, as you were writing the book, what mental and physical health impacts of loneliness were particularly troubling or mobilizing and motivating for you as you were putting this together?
Yeah, so I think when we all think about loneliness, we do immediately think that there's likely to be a mental health impact. And that's in a way the most obvious impact. So if you're lonely, it is true, you are more prone to anxiety or depression, or even at the extreme, suicide. I think what's less obvious, and of course your work really helped shed the light on, is that loneliness has a really profound impact on physical health as well. And why this is really because we are creatures of togetherness. We were and are hardwired to connect. And so what happens is when we are in a state of loneliness, this is a state that evolution has taught us is a bad state to be in. So what happens? Our body goes into fight or flight mode. Our adrenaline goes up, our levels of cortisol, our stress hormones in our body go up, our blood pressure goes up, our pulse rate goes up. All of these essentially signaling to us, go and find your tribe, go and hunt and gather with other people. But in contemporary life, in the same way that if you were to put your car in first gear, that would be a good thing to do in the short term. But if you were doing it for a protracted period, it'd be terrible for your car and for your engine. That's what's going on in contemporary life. We're staying lonely for protracted periods, and that really affects our health, with loneliness increasing our risk of heart disease by 29%, our risk of stroke by 32%, with 30% more likely to die prematurely if we are lonely. And, I believe in your work, Ted, as you found, loneliness is worse for us than obesity, worse for us than not exercising, and as bad for us as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. So yes, it really should be. I'm totally with you. It should be a public health priority, and yet it isn't. What's also fascinating is that groups of people who are particularly connected, so particularly unlonely, get a health dividend. And there was one group that I studied in my book, the Haredim. These are the ultra-religious Jews in Israel. So you may be familiar, the men wear the black hats, the women are very modestly dressed, wear wigs and cover themselves up. Now, this is a group by all traditional thinking about, health, and you would think is likely to be relatively unhealthy compared to the general population. Why? Because they smoke more, they exercise less, they're more likely to be obese. The food that they eat, whilst delicious, is, not necessarily the healthiest food. They're very low on vitamin D, even though they're living in Israel because they're so covered up. And yet this group, their life expectancy is significantly longer than the average Israeli. And when researchers looked into why this was, what they discovered and what they think is by far the most likely explanation is because this is a group that are really close to each other, that never feel lonely, that are really connected, that know that they always have people around them who they can rely upon and who support them. Of course, if you transgress the norms of this group, you are not, you are politely or otherwise asked to leave. But for those who are inside the group, they get not only a dividend in terms of feeling bonded to each other, but a dividend in terms of health as well, which is fascinating.
And I've talked with Julianne about this. You go to different corners of the world where you find the people with the longest longevity, where you see these 100-year-olds who look, healthier than I do. And the thing that knits many of those regions together and is similar is this strong social connection that people have. I think there's a group of octogenarians in Sardinia and also in Okinawa. And social connection ends up being a really important part of what keeps them alive, for sure. Everywhere I've been and talked about this data, it's the same thing that really resonates with people. It's the smoking 15 cigarettes a day really resonates with people and gives people a reference point. I don't know if you've encountered that as well, where the thing that hits home is this 15 cigarettes a day is the same thing as being socially isolated. Do you encounter that when you talk about the research with others?
Yes, definitely. Because, it really lands it, doesn't it? How can something that is this bad for us not be really high up on government's agendas, on businesses' agendas? Because interestingly, it's not just our health that loneliness is bad for. Loneliness is bad for our wealth as well. And not only in terms of increasing Medicare costs and costs on health budgets, but also because lonely workers are less productive, less motivated, more likely to quit a company than workers who aren't lonely. So loneliness is, is a very significant drain on businesses. And yet, again, barely on business leaders' radars to date.
And you bring up a really good point, and you talked about this earlier about the people who are either resilient or vulnerable, and maybe that's a good place to move next, which is who are the people who are at risk for increased loneliness, both before the pandemic, because I think right now for many of us, kind of the pandemic is the way that we see the world. But I do think it's important to kind of think about what things looked like before, because that's hopefully eventually what we will start to look like, in a few years or so. Both before and during the pandemic, who are the groups of people that are most vulnerable to loneliness?
So I think what's really interesting and surprising, perhaps, is firstly that in many ways loneliness doesn't discriminate. Everyone can be lonely, rich, poor, old, young, male, female. Even before the pandemic, 1 in 10 Americans were lonely always or often. 1 in 5 millennials said that they didn't have a single friend at all, which is really a very stark figure. 3 in 5 18 to 34-year-olds say that they feel lonely often or sometimes, and in the United Kingdom, a half of 10 to 15-year-olds feel lonely. So all groups can feel lonely. The elderly, of course, too. Figures of loneliness amongst the elderly are heartbreaking. And yet,
sí, está bien. Ajá.
And yet there are some groups who are lonelier than others. And I think one of the most surprising things, and it was actually my students who were one of the reasons why I started researching this subject, because one of the most surprising things to me, and I think to people, is that it's actually the young who are the loneliest in society. So everyone can be lonely, but the young are the loneliest. And through the pandemic, what we've seen is that from already these incredibly high bases of loneliness, we've really seen loneliness levels rise very significantly over the past 15, 16 months, with some surveys suggesting that maybe about half of the population are currently feeling lonely. But again, certain groups even lonelier, young women actually, maybe something we want to come back to, and also people on low income and the unemployed, because whilst you can be lonely and rich for sure, if you are unemployed or if you are on low income, you are more likely to be lonely.
What is your sense about the contributors to loneliness for young people and for young women in particular as well?
So, there's a whole host of drivers for why we as a society have become lonelier. But looking at young people in particular, I believe you cannot come away from really digging into the academic literature without feeling very strongly that social media and our smartphones have a lot to answer for here. What we've seen since about 2010, really in lockstep with rising social media usage amongst this age group, and of course smartphone usage more generally, what we've seen is real rising levels of loneliness pretty much in parallel. Now, of course, this could be coincidence. Correlation doesn't mean causation, we know that. Yet, and I think up until about 2019, it was really hard to say categorically that social media was making young people lonely. It was really hard to definitively prove that. But in 2019, there was a very seminal study that took place at Stanford University in California. And where the researchers, it was a real gold standard of a study, and the researchers had a control group with 1,500 students who were told to use Facebook as usual. And then 1,500 other students were told to not use Facebook for 2 months. And then they compared how these different groups behaved and felt. And they saw really significant differences. The group who went off Facebook, they didn't just spend more time on other platforms, they did more in person with others, in person with friends and family. And we know that in-person interactions are qualitatively better than virtual ones, especially the more stripped back virtual ones of social media. We also found out from this research that this group who went off Facebook were significantly happier and significantly less lonely. And similar studies have been replicated since with other social media platforms, with Snapchat, with Instagram, and they've found similar results. So we know empirically that social media has a lot to answer for. But in my research, I also interviewed a lot of teenagers, and their stories, really brought home how excluding social media can be for a young person. It was a 14-year-old boy, Peter, who I spoke to, who told me about how he would post on Instagram and then be waiting, hoping for somebody to like one of his posts. And when they didn't, really berating himself, saying, what am I doing wrong? And feeling so invisible, he said. And then there was a girl, Claudia, whose friends had told her that they weren't going out celebrating one evening, a 16-year-old girl after school. And she was back in her room and she was scrolling through her feeds and she saw them and on her feeds. And she said she felt so excluded. She hid in her room for a week. And of course, Ted, unfortunately, bullying, exclusion, was always around for kids and was always a danger. But what the difference is today is that, firstly, it doesn't escape you. So if you are being cyberbullied, and in the United Kingdom, 65% of students have been cyberbullied. So if you are being bullied, you can be bullied 24/7, so it doesn't escape you. Secondly, your exclusion, your isolation, the fact that nobody's liking your posts or that you're not in the photos with your other friends is visible. So your shame of exclusion is very public. And also the adults in a child and young person's life often isn't even aware this is going on. so can't step in and intervene in the way that a teacher might have seen a child not being asked to sit with others and intervened, or a parent might have seen a child not being invited to something and got involved. Here, because so much of their social lives has migrated to social media, it's also not visible. Just on the, I think there's kind of just why, other thoughts on why social media, and again, it's just one reason for this problem, but with teenagers, especially, I think it's really germane to the fact that, such high percentages, talking 3 and 5, almost a half of teenagers feeling lonely often. Another is, on these media, it's true for adults as well, it's very easy to believe that everyone's more popular than you. I mean, because nobody posts on Facebook, oh, I sat at home on my own and ate a packet of cookies, and you don't write that, do you? So everyone's talking about how much fun they're having and posting pictures with other people, and of course it's easy in relative terms to think that, but also with young people who are creating their sense of self. I think there's also a danger that these media exacerbate and accelerate a sense of disconnectedness from self as well. Because social media essentially casts you in the role of hustler, selling yourself for likes, for follows, for shares. And of course, to do that, you create, as one 14-year-old smart, actually Californian girl told me, she said, our lives, it's like we're living our lives like avatars in a video game. So where you're feeling disconnected from your true self because this inauthentic self is the one that you're having to portray in order to receive the likes that, especially for young people, are so crucial to obtain. So just a few thoughts on that.
And I remember I think one of the striking questions you pose to the reader is, think about the last time you took a selfie. Why did you do that? Is it because you wanted to create this idealized avatar of yourself, or was it because you wanted to be authentic and actually portray, what your life is actually looking like right now with that bag of cookies? And that we should ask ourselves that, right? What am I doing this for? Why am I holding this up and presenting this to others? Oh, go ahead.
And that just because the teenagers who I interviewed, they'd always say to me, but it's not just us, it's you guys too, who are always on your phones. And that's something that when we talk about, those teenagers, but we're all guilty of it, and any of us who use social media are guilty, I'm sure, of chasing those elusive likes and follows ourselves as well, and feeling bad when something isn't retweeted. And but also, aren't we all guilty? I mean, I confess, I am, of sitting on the sofa next to our loved one, our head in our phones, not even really hearing them, so distracted by these devices. So young people, it's causing problems to young people, but it's definitely part of the reason older people are lonely as well, for sure.
And one of the things, so you talked about the belief that other people are more popular than you. You have this nice abbreviation of BOMP, but there's another one that I when I read it, because this is a concept that I know about in teaching about health psychology and health behavior, and I thought to myself, gosh, I hadn't thought of this before, but it makes so much sense. The CAGE questionnaire, and questions we can ask ourselves or others about whether or not people might be I'll say generously using their phones too much in social media, or addicted to phones as well. Can you talk a little bit about those questions and how we might use that to self kind of diagnose if we need to put it down, or maybe to highlight it for another?
So, obviously it's quite it's a pejorative or loaded or big word, addicted.
Yes.
And yet I think it is actually fair to use it when it comes to our smartphones, because as we now know, these devices, but specifically the programs on them, our social media programs, are really designed to be addictive. I mean, from the, like slot machines, I mean, very similar design ethos as slot machines. Yeah, keep pulling that slot, keep scrolling, you know, the limitless feed, the colors, the fact that they know that we get a dopamine rush, you know, a physiological response, similar to if we've taken drugs when we get a retweet or a like. So, you know, social media companies are smart, and they have designed products that will keep us hooked, because that's how they make their money, because the longer we're on them and the more our attention is on them, the more advertisers will want to advertise on their platforms and reward them for it. So so I think addiction is the right term, and I actually go as far as to say that in many ways I think of social media as the tobacco industry of the 21st century, and should be regulated as such. And I know that in the United States, you know, regulation is a kind of often seen as a last resort. But I think what's interesting is that there is growing bipartisan support in the United States for greater regulation of social media companies. And in the United Kingdom, we actually currently have a bill going, a draft bill was just put through Parliament just a couple of weeks ago, the online safety bill, is going to impose very significant care on social media companies, whereby if they are found responsible for harming the psychological or physical health of users on their platforms, they will be penalized, and very significantly. The UK government's talking about up to 10% of revenue is their amount that they're talking. A company could be penalized for creating this sort of harm. And elsewhere in Europe, we're seeing similar legislation being mooted. So I think this is the way the puck is going.
And certainly when children are involved too, you know, where a lot of this is centered around protecting children and protecting the developing child and their developing brain, that ends up being really important too. So I want to turn to the adults, so to speak, in the room, where, you know, many of the people on the call here are business owners, they run businesses. The next few months are when many of us, at least in California, are going to begin to return to work in person. At the same time, many of us want to incorporate work from home into our working lives. I can say at UCLA, it was something like 10% of the staff that were surveyed wanted to come back to the office 5 days a week. Everybody else wanted to have some work from home. And I'm wondering, in your research on this issue of remote work, what should we be on the lookout for as organizations increasingly adopt hybrid and remote work arrangements?
So as well as being a professor, I also sit on the board of Warner Music Group, a NASDAQ listed company, one of the world's biggest music companies. And so this is very much an issue that we're talking about in the boardroom. And when I speak to fellow directors of public companies, it's something that clearly is a big issue. So in all size companies, I know that this is on people's minds. I'd say just a few things on remote work and returning back to office, and what leaders should be thinking about. Firstly, it's really important to recognize that in the same way that different people had different experiences of the pandemic, different people have different feelings about going back into the office. And sometimes it's around gender lines, and sometimes it's around age lines. I just saw quite a big recent survey, this was in the UK, where it was clear that actually young men wanted to go into the office more than any other group. So which was interesting. So I think when you're thinking about your stuff, I think one thing is, how granular can you be if you're trying to figure out who wants what? And if you're doing kind of big surveys, you know, can you get some sort of granularity in that? I think the big challenge, and this really needs to be the summer of reconnection in many ways, the big challenge is how do you as leaders help your staff now reconnect after months of being outside the office? Really, it's less about how many days you all end up deciding to be in the office. I think it's more about how do you reconnect more broadly. And part of that is about being in the office at the same time. And I do think it's important that when companies are deciding, let's say we're going to have 3 days a week that are physically in the office, that they are the same 3 days. So I think that's something to think about. Another thing is, when your staff are together, physically together, how can you help them feel more connected? And there are a couple of really proven things to think about. One is eating together. There was fascinating research done in Chicago with firefighters, and the researchers found that companies of firefighters who ate together not only felt more bonded to each other, but they also performed twice as well as companies that didn't. And Bank of America did a similar pilot in which they, in one of their buildings, gave everyone in the building a break time at the same time. And also they found both a significant rise in how bonded people felt, but also a significant increase in productivity. Volunteering together. That's another proven way that companies have helped their staff feel bonded. Providing paid days off to volunteer with staff encouraged to do things together. Salesforce, for example, is a San Francisco based, not only using California examples, but California seems, some of your companies are ahead of the game here, is a company that offers up to 9 paid days off a year for their staff to volunteer. But it's also about valuing qualities in employees that really over the past few decades have been undervalued. Qualities like caring for each other, helpfulness, kindness. We've really been living in a time where these have been viewed as, not only softer qualities, but in some cases undesirable qualities, with qualities like competitiveness and determination really hypervalorized. I'm not saying those aren't important, and yet, again, from the point of cohesion and connectedness and performance, valuing kindness and caring for each other really pays off. And again, another, I think, California company, Cisco, to speak to here, they have a scheme, this is a global tech company, they have a scheme whereby anyone up and down the company, from the receptionist to the CEO, can nominate anyone else for a cash reward of up to $10,000 for being particularly kind or helpful. And I love this scheme. And, because anyone can nominate anyone else. And I don't think it's a coincidence that here you have a company that's saying we actively value acts of kindness. We actively want to incentivize and reward our staff who behave in such ways that this is the company whose turnover is half the industry average, and also who was voted this year for the 4th year running in Forbes the best company in the world to work for by its employees. So, getting people to do things together and valuing care and kindness more explicitly in the workplace are, I think, 2 really tangible things that companies can do.
And this really touches on what I think a central theme throughout the book, which is that our kind of dog eat dog, hyper competitive, individualistic form of capitalism is an underlying driver, along with discrimination by age and race and gender and LGBTQ status, and all of those things kind of put together. And then if you add on top of that the social media and phones, this is how we got to this lonely century. And one of the things that very much resonated with, when I was reading the book, was your discussion that we've got to figure out ways, both as individuals, businesses, and institutions like government, to find ways to reconnect caring and compassion with capitalism, just as you said. And as I read that, I kept thinking to myself, how do we do this? So if I run a firm, like, what steps should I be taking to reconcile caring with my business? You've touched on a few things like civic engagement and volunteering. I don't know if there are other ones that you've thought of as well.
Well, first, from a business perspective, it's really important to acknowledge and explicitly acknowledge that loneliness is costing your business. Once you view it as a cost, once you view this as a business issue, then of course addressing it becomes important. And actually, there's a fascinating statistic that people who don't have a friend at work are 7 times less engaged at their job than people who do. So, you know, really pragmatic reasons to tackle it. My book has lots of examples. We've talked about, you know, just a couple today, but lots and lots of examples. I think to your broader point about reconciling capitalism with care. Firstly, it's only relatively new. It's only really since the 80s that this disconnect between capitalism and care and compassion really existed. Before then, the two were much closer aligned. And even if we think of the godfather of free market economics, Adam Smith, the person who really, you know, really came up with the whole idea of the invisible hand of the market, he, at the same time as he was writing his very important work, The Wealth of Nations, also wrote about The Theory of Moral Sentiment, which talked about the importance of community, the importance of care. So it's actually a relatively new phenomenon that capitalism and care have been so disconnected. And I think it is partly, as you say, as I write in my book, because of the increasingly individualistic mindset that the harsher form of capitalism, and to be clear, I'm not anti-capitalist in any form, it's just that the pendulum has swung so far in one direction that we came as individuals to see ourselves as hustlers rather than helpers, as takers rather than givers, as competitors rather than collaborators. And we came to be so focused on our immediate self-interest that we really lost sight of the collective interest and what we needed to do for each other. And of course, an I first world was inevitably going to lead to a lonelier one.
And as you describe as well, the sort of I first, when you couple that with these new technologies that amplify that experience of me as being really important or presenting the best version of myself, regardless of how authentic it is, how many people can feel left out of that because it doesn't, you know, they don't feel like they are measuring up to everyone else. Yeah, imagine if these social technologies were really more in the service of creating community. And this was something else that I thought was really, you know, I've thought about it in my own neighborhoods that I live in as well. You talk a lot about, you know, we've talked about business, we've talked about individuals, but also this kind of reduction or missingness of the social connection infrastructure, whether it's public libraries and so on. And I was really taken with your idea of creating a new category of business, pro-community enterprises. You quote sociologist Ray Oldenburg, who talks about these third places where we can gather. And I'm wondering if you could talk more about what you envision that looking like in the future.
Yes. So one of the reasons that we have become so much lonelier over the past few decades, especially actually since 2008 for this reason, is that there's been a steady depletion and defunding of what we might think of as the community, the infrastructure of community. So public parks, public libraries, youth clubs, daycare centres, elderly daycare centres. People need physical spaces to be together, to do things together, if they are to feel connected and if we are as a society to come together again. And yet really since the financial crisis, this is true in the United States, where we've seen like federal funding for libraries really slashed by 2/3 since 2008, but something that we see all across the world. But it's not just the state who can provide these spaces, physical spaces where people can come together. What I think is exciting is that the market has a really significant role it can play here as well. And we see this actually in a very charming example in South Korea that I write about in the book, where they have these daytime discos for retirees, where literally thousands of elderly people come and dance during the day in these daytime discos. And, you know, they pay an entrance fee and then they buy their drinks. but they dance. And, you know, these are businesses making money, but providing a wonderful service. So whether it's businesses like that, whether it's co-working spaces, whether it's co-living spaces, whether it's, you know, independent local stores who anchor their local communities, places like in San Francisco, there was this great cafe I used to go to called Mission Pie, which, if any of you are from San Francisco on this call may know, you know, which was a place, you know, where, you know, in one corner you'd have the knitting clatch kind of knitting, and in another you'd have somebody like on a typewriter typing their novel, and it was a real community, the kind of place where you knew people's names. Or, you know, your local independent bookstore, that's often a real hub for a neighborhood. So what I talk about in the book is we should be creating a new tax bracket for businesses like these that are demonstrably pro-community, so that they actually are able to thrive in a world in which, to be frank, we're really having to contend with a countervailing force, something that's really accelerated during the pandemic, which is a shift to what I call contactless living. Because, of course, even before the pandemic, you could order your food on Grubhub or do your yoga with Adrienne. But during the pandemic, what we've seen is across the board and across the world, a shift to online shopping, online ordering your food, online Amazon rather than your local bookstore, online exercise rather than going to a local place. And the danger is, and what worries me, is that the convenience of contactless living may prove to be super alluring, may remain super alluring for many people. And yeah, Ted, sorry.
Oh no, I was going to say, and in addition to, like, you know, the daily living pieces, you also talk about the experiences of Noreena Hertz and contactless job interview experiences as well that are mediated by AI as being potentially problematic too.
Yes, so Noreena Hertz was my pseudonym. I did a job interview as Noreena Hertz, where I was interviewed not by a person, but by a computer, by an algorithm, which was looking at every movement of mine, every twitch, every blink, the cadence of my voice, how many times I paused, how many times I said, and recording it all and matching that all up against their ideal candidate for the job. It was a job, ironically, in human resources. I was thankful because I never met a human in the process. I didn't get the job, by the way. But what an uncomfortable experience it was to, you know, not know if you're speaking too long or get the body language cues from the interviewer about, you know, are you going down the right path here with your answer? And just this very soul destroying experience where you're also being judged by algorithms, which we know are can inherently be very prone to biases, you know, because of course they're looking at the historic ideal candidate, and their historic ideal candidate is likely to have been hired with a whole host of prejudices and biases involved. So yes, contactless living, risking making us feel less connected to each other, also risking us, I think there is a case of use it or lose it. And that was something I saw with my students when I was setting them group assignments, and you may have seen it with some of yours, that increasing numbers were struggling with in-person, face-to-face interaction. And in fact, there's one Ivy League university in the United States, I won't disclose who it is, where the president told me, it's so bad here, we're actually running how to read a face in real life classes for our students because it's got so bad. So another reason why contactless living is not desirable.
And I think I'll end my questions here by just saying, I think one of the things that's really fantastic about your book is that you describe both the potential dark side, Black Mirror-esque side of contactless living and having connection as a commodity. and how we should really be intentional about our in-person experiences. Won't have a chance to touch on that, but it's such a valuable part of your book. So I'll stop my questions here, and I want to turn to questions that we got in the chat. So the first thing is, your book has some examples of some pretty drastic measures within this loneliness economy that people have been taking to combat loneliness. You just mentioned the remedial classes for kind of how to perceive faces, paying for friendship with services like renting a friend. What are your thoughts on both what this means, and should those businesses, I guess the broader question is, what does it mean to have businesses like this, and how should we move forward?
Yes, so it may be surprising to some of the people who haven't yet read the book, but you can rent friends. And this is something I discovered in my research. And when I was in New York, I rented Brittany, a 24-year-old Ivy League grad, for a few hours. And we went downtown, we drank matcha tea, we went to a bookstore, we went into Urban Outfitters and tried on hats and sunglasses. Obviously, it wasn't like being with an old friend, but it was fun. It was like when you're with a new friend and you're kind of vibing off each other. And she, seemed to be so interested in everything I was saying. Of course she was, because I was paying her. So there are 620,000 friends for rent on the site where I found Brittany. So what's fascinating is that the market is stepping in. Interesting to note too, of course, is that this isn't unprecedented historically. If you think about 19th century English literature, novels, Victorian novels, you'll often come across aristocratic ladies who have their companion, and their companion was, basically a paid friend. So the idea that you can pay for friendship, isn't such a new one. And in some cases, of course, from an individual level, it can make a real difference, paid friendship, in terms of making you feel less alone, less lonely. And of course, we do pay for care, for children, for elderly relatives. So it's not such an alien concept. Where I start asking questions is, what would it mean for society if we were to migrate our friendships ever more to paid friendships? Or, as is going to be increasingly likely, if we were to trade our human friendships for friendships with social robots. Right. As we're already seeing in Japan, which is kind of ahead of the game here. Again, from an individual level, I think it could alleviate feelings of loneliness. And in Japan, you have very heartwarming stories of elderly women knitting bonnets for their robot carers. And yet, from a societal perspective, not very much is asked of you once you're paying for friendship. You don't have to be kind. You don't have to be reciprocal. You don't have to be civil. You don't have to see how you can help them. And I worry that the skills that really underpin inclusive democracy, reciprocity, kindness, and civility in a world in which we migrate our friendships to the market in whatever form, that we won't practice those skills, those important skills enough.
Yeah, that use it or lose it idea of, if we kind of turn things over and increasingly interact with non-humans, whether it be our Alexa or Google Assistant or the cute seal, it could potentially create this, we lose these skills, right? Another question that came in is why, so I guess this is back to the work from home and, as people are increasingly interested in doing that. Is there, I think one of the things that in the pre-pandemic workforce is that people were isolated and lonely, but there were things like office gossip and awkward small talk. Do those still have, as we come back into that and get reacclimated, do those things still have value for us? Those small kind of acquaintance level conversations?
Great question, because actually the research is really clear on this. Even a 30-second exchange with a stranger, with a barista in a cafe, makes a huge difference to how connected we feel and how happy we feel. So those moments at the water cooler, even if you don't really know the person, consider them to be a significant friend, where you're just going, oh, how was your weekend? Those are moments that punctuated our day in the past. which actually went a really long way in making us feel less lonely. And the trouble, of course, as I'm sure all of us have experienced over the past year or so, as we've had to migrate so many of our meetings, almost all our meetings, to Zoom, is that we often don't have those buffers. We haven't built in those buffers. So we're just going into a meeting. There's no chance to do that actually very important chit chat that creates the social glue between us and is very important for connecting employees and for bonding us. There's no time for that. And also the format isn't conducive to it, because this is a conversation you would have with one person, not with a whole kind of gallery of people listening in. So again, this speaks to how can we, in this more hybrid situation, engineer these. And I think one thing moving forward is, let's not default to Zoom as our default. You know, there could be people who you are having a meeting with who are actually in your geographic proximity. So maybe it's not in the office, but go and have a coffee with them, or go and have a walk with them and do your meeting that way. There is this danger that we're now defaulting, and we're in danger of doing that. And then when you're in the office, you know, do take that moment, that pause to, you know, say to somebody, hey, how are you? Just have those short exchanges that, you know, we may be rustier at, because it pays off.
Yeah, you describe in your book some of the research on people sending emails to people who are actually well within the same, you know, a very close proximity to one another. And perhaps that's something that we need to rethink in the future and actually, you know, knock on that door or something like that, right? Another question that came in was, you know, we've talked a lot about, you know, what the problems are, and in terms of solutions on the individual level, we've touched on some of these here and there, as far as phone use and as far as connecting with other employees. I don't know if, or, you know, in the workplace. And are there other things that we can do, I'll say first as individuals, to try to combat this lonely century as we move forward? And then maybe if there's a little bit of time, we can talk more broadly about community and democracy. But we'll talk about individuals first.
Sure. So much that we can do as individuals. Yes, we are addicted to these devices, but we can try harder ourselves at breaking that addiction. I try. And I know that if my phone is within reach, I really reach out for it. So I try in the evenings and put it physically out of reach, my phone. And I try and take a digital Sabbath. So once a week, try and really stay off my devices so that I'm present with those around me. So that's something we can definitely do. Another thing we can do is we can really consciously nurture our own local stores, our own local studios, our own local cafes. You know, we can make the choice to trade off connection for convenience, and, you know, and walk down to our local place. And, you know, especially for those, as I'm sure many on this call are, you know, if cost isn't the ultimate decision maker here, you know, pay that extra couple of dollars at your local bookstore for the book rather than buying it on Amazon as well. And do we really need our book 24 hours
to this afternoon?
Probably not. So you know, consciously nurturing our own neighborhoods, and also not only the shops, but also community events and community activities. You know, I'm somebody who really, before I started researching the book, I have to be frank, you know, I saw myself very much as a global citizen. I was always traveling. I was in the United States 10 times a year. And I didn't invest enough in my own local neighborhood. And as I was researching my book, I really came to realize and be reminded how important that is, how important for our happiness, how important for feeling not isolated ourselves. So show up at community events, initiate local community events as well. Another thing we can do is volunteer ourselves. Are we doing, is there service that we could be offering? Again, it's a win-win. We help someone else that way, but it also feels great for us. There's even something known as a helper's high, you know, a real physiological positive dividend for helping others. People who don't help anyone at all live shorter lives on average than people who do. So again, it pays off in terms of our health. And then I think finally, in terms of individuals, just especially now, given how many people are lonely, think about, is there anyone in your own network who might be feeling lonely right now? And if there is, even just send them a text or pick up the phone and phone them up, or if you can meet them in a safe, socially distanced way, meet them physically, face to face, because just showing someone that you're thinking about them, that you care about them, can make a huge difference to how they feel. So just a few thoughts on that front.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. And maybe the last question I'll just kind of quickly touch on is what's great about your book is that you describe that we as individuals are part of a society. So we have to be intentional about the choices that we make to build that society. And then you also talk about how we need to do a better job of pulling together to practice community, much like what Visionary Women is doing in terms of practicing community and making an impact. You describe things like the Umaganda activities in Rwanda, Germany talks, and I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about how we can do a better job of pulling together to practice community and practice democracy.
Yeah, so this isn't a party political point, but it's true across the world that societies are more fractured today than ever before, on political lines, on ethnic lines, on racial lines, on gender lines. So we are incredibly fractured as societies. And the mission really has to be not only about feeling less lonely ourselves, but how can we reconnect as societies? And yeah, my final chapter is full of ideas here. And maybe I'll just end on just one, because it's such an inspiring one. It was one that a German newspaper initiated, Die Zeit, where the journalists were very concerned about growing political fragmentation in Germany. So what they did was they set up an initiative whereby anyone across Germany could put their name on this database. They would state their political views, and they would be matched up with somebody with radically different views. So they matched up people who were really pro-immigration with people who were anti-immigration. They matched up people who were for Europe for people who were anti-Europe. They matched up trade unionists with CEOs, so really different people. And across Germany, tens of thousands of people met up. They met up in beer gardens, in cafes, in parks. And all they had to do was speak to each other for 2 hours, just speak. And what was fascinating was just a 2-hour exchange radically changed how the people felt about the other. They said that they'd be much more likely to invite someone like that to their social gathering. They said they understood so much more what they had in common. Often it was shared concerns about their families. And also, interestingly, they said that they trusted Germans in general more, having taken part in this exercise, than how they'd answered the question before doing it. So initiatives such as these, where we consciously bring different people together, and ideally even do things with people different to us. Often doing things with people different to us is the best way to learn about what we have in common. These are things that we as individuals should be championing for sure.
Thank you for motivating us. We have a lot of work to do, everybody on this call, to create a better world, both in our immediate universe, but also the broader one. And really, I highly recommend this book for everyone here. And again, that last chapter is really spectacular. So thank you for this conversation. I wish we could keep going, but I should turn it back over to Nadine. And it has been a pleasure talking with you today.
Thank you so much, Ted. Thank you.
Thank you, Noreena. Thank you, Ted. I'm sure our audience, I hope you were all as inspired today as I was by this talk. So don't forget to go and get your copy of Noreena's book, The Lonely Century: How to Restore Connection in a World That's Pulling Us Apart. And Visionary Women will bring you connection and friendship and a place to come together. So it's good for your health, since you'll never be lonely. and we'll continue to practice community and supporting each other and supporting women and girls. So hope that you will all continue to support us and go to our website for more information. And thank you on behalf of Visionary Women to Noreena and Ted. This was inspiring, informative. And as Ted said, we have a lot of work to do. So let's continue to do that work together.
Thank you so much for inviting me, and hopefully next time I will physically be in a room with many of you. Bye-bye.
Look forward to that.